hasn't come up in a bit in my more recent videos, but in my day job, I work as an archivist. If you don't know what that means, the easiest way to describe it is by thinking of a library or a museum. Imagine the people working in back, making sure everything is accounted for, properly arranged, and properly preserved. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic gist of things. What you are more likely to know about me from this channel so far is that I'm a massive nerd. One such nerdy passion is anime figures. Now, I watch some anime, bits and pieces really, but I adore figures. I think it's got something to do with my magpie brain, screaming at me to collect things and build a pretty shiny nest out of them. Now, I don't own many figures myself, largely because as a hobby it's pretty cost prohibitive, and I've got other things I want to save my money for. But I still love talking about, looking at, and theorizing about anime figures. So let's dig in a bit on the idea of value, because there certainly is value in anime figures. And let's look at them from the mind of an archivist and try to determine what factors give value to anime figures. In archival science, there are a lot of ways we can ascribe value to an object. Worth noting, however, is that, at least in theory, we don't consider monetary value when we speak of value. We still need to think of money in logistical terms, because we need to obtain records, retain them, and preserve them. But unlike, say, an auction house, even in a for-profit business, the point of an archive isn't to grow wealth, at least not directly. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce 3 concepts of value that I want to discuss today. These concepts are direct value, enduring historical value, and relational value. A singular record, or in this case figure, can hold multiple types of value to varying degrees, and all of this may end up factoring into something's end cost in a resale market. First up, we've got direct value. When it comes to something like anime figures, this can be a little harder to nail down relative to other types of records. Let me explain. Say we've got a centuries-old manuscript in our possession. The direct value would be the words within the manuscript, literally, what can we learn and gain from reading this text? Direct value doesn't concern itself with how many copies of this manuscript might exist, or if it was signed by the author or not. With direct value, we are looking exclusively at what can this record do for us with its intended purpose. So bringing this back to anime figures, this becomes a little more subjective in scope. Let's take my Ike figure, for example. As a big fan of Fire Emblem, as well as Ike himself, it brings me great direct value to display him and be able to see him around my apartment. While this is direct value because it's the intended purpose of the figure, it's not objective like in the manuscript example. You may not enjoy Fire Emblem as much as I do, and thus Ike would possess less direct value to you. Next, we've got enduring historical value. When we look at anime figures through this lens, we can say there's more of a community-focused lens over enduring historical value compared to the individual lens we saw with direct value. This is because we're looking not at the object itself, but the metadata that surrounds it. There's lots to consider with metadata, which is, simply speaking, data about data. When we tie this back to anime figures, we can ask questions such as, when is this figure from? Who is the designer who made it? What series does it portray? How many were made, and is there anything specific about this particular figure that makes it additionally distinct? Let's tackle each of these in order. When is this figure from? Let's take, for example, this Astro Boy figure from 1980. It could potentially hold more value than an Android figure produced in the last few years. Why is that? Because when we look at something that's aged, it tells us multiple things about the time period in which it came from. In Astro Boy's case, it tells us what materials and design principles were used in making figures at the time. It also tells us something about the toy collection market in the era, and how people had the foresight to hold on to things in good condition, realizing they would eventually increase in value. Who is the designer who made this figure? And this one is fairly straightforward. Is it made by a big notable company like Good Smile or Kotobukiya? Or is it made by a relatively unknown company and/or artist? This can get especially granular at the level of famous artists. For example, depending on who you ask, having a box signed by the artist may increase the value in the eyes of some, but decrease it in others. This is not to say small designers are a bad thing. More so just recognizing that years from now, it'll be easier for archivists and historians to determine where a figure came from if it was made by a more prolific manufacturer or artist. What series does it portray? Also a fairly straightforward concept. Don't get me wrong here, hidden gems are awesome and deserve figures and recognition too. But anime and manga, which are cultural phenomena, your Pokemon, your Sailor Moon, your Dragon Ball, they tell us a lot about the historical time period in which they were introduced. Looking at Pokemon, for example, Pokemania wasn't just a show, or a game, or some cards. It was a cultural shift. Not only did it encapsulate now multiple generations of its storytelling, it, along with the other aforementioned series, changed how cultures in the West interacted with Japanese media. What before was seen somewhat as a novelty became household names alongside Western media. By being attached to a series that had had an impact in this way, it's clear to see how a series can impact historical value. How many were made, and are there any distinguishing characteristics about this particular figure? I'm going to cover these two together and fairly quickly since they're pretty simple. If a figure is 1 out of 100, it's got more potential value than one that is 1 out of 1,000. And as for any distinguishing characteristics, signatures, production errors, and other things that make the figures unique within the production line, all of these things can add historical value in the long term. Finally, I'd like to briefly take a look at relational value as another form of value that can be intrinsic to anime figures. Within archival science, relational value is the idea for why we build collections. If you have one journal from a famous poet, that's awesome and cool and tells us a little about their life. But let's say you have many journals from the same poet. Not only does each hold value on its own, but they can also give us additional context for one another. For example, you can better understand the process of them honing their craft from earlier journals to later ones. Bringing this back to anime figures, relational value can look a couple of different ways. In one sense, you could have a collection of Nendroids. Because each Nendroid is designed by the same company and with similar artistic styling within Nendroids as a line, we can, as per our previous journal example, see how the design philosophy for Nendroids has evolved over time. In another sense, we can collect a series of figures that are meant to go together. They're all part of the same story, and while each holds value on its own, they hold additional value by virtue of being together within a collection. And I guess you could call that an introduction to some of the principles of archival theory through the lens of anime figures. If you liked this video and want to see more about anime figures in terms of history, collection, and design philosophy, be sure to subscribe, because I'd love to make more content like this. I hope you have a nice day.